We were actually in doubt when we made this session about, oh, do people really want to hear about this? And it's great that we have a full house, because it's honestly something that we think is extremely important. And I can say that when I meet other founders and they call me or I call them and say, oh, we screw up, a lot of things it's because we haven't foreseen these things that we'll discuss today. And I can honestly say all the mistakes that we will see today, I've done. And I've done them multiple times. Of course, I'll try to limit them in the future, but it's just something we see again and again and again. So we decided to make this talk today where we are both having a different perspectives. So it's actually by purpose you hear some of the same topics several times. So if you think the third time you hear about shareholders agreement, you think, oh my God, why are they saying that again? That's because it's extremely important. But we have that from different perspectives today. So we have a tight program. Start with an introduction and also a quick wrap up of last time. We have Anne Cathrine from PreSeed, there's a lawyer there, talk about what she sees and what you can do to basically don't make all the mistakes that they have done in the past. We have a break. We have Søren from Archii that also tell it from his current founder perspective. And then we take the Q&A in the end, a quick wrap up, and the most important thing, beer. So we'll be finalizing this by 7:30. So we'll actually spend 2 minutes just going through what we discussed last time. How many of you were here last time? I'm just curious. Oh, cool. So we had 25% something. What did we say? We had Heini from Vivino. And, oh, I can't remember his first name from Zliide. Morten from Zliide talking. So what were some of the lessons in this talk about platforms? I think it was very nice when Heini showed this about that things actually take time, right? It actually took them 1 year, even for a very successful app like Vivino, to reach 100,000 downloads. And you can see now when you read about these, oh my God, they're so successful, most likely they have done this in 3 months. No, I guess they're on the 8th, 9th, 10th year, something like that. It takes time. Also a very interesting point that Heini brought up was about not to focusing on how beautiful your app looks. And it's really about these iteration times, getting them down so you can do something really, really ugly, but fast. And he actually said that, well, they basically outcompeted some of the really beautiful apps in the App Store because he was all about functionality and not the looks. I think that's also an extremely important lesson for other entrepreneurs that want to go into the platform game. One of the mistakes he did was also to go out and travel the world early on to go for international investors. It's a classic mistake. It's not limited to people building platforms, but early stage investors are local. I'm actually now involved in a new startup, and that's a biotech startup which I'm helping. And we could maybe get interest from VCs in Silicon Valley, but it would just be a waste of time. They're not going to invest in a really, really early startup. It's local. And local is about 50, 100 kilometers from here. So don't repeat that mistake. Heini also talked a lot about PR and awareness and how that actually raised, I think it was something they had the blog post, and that actually helped them secure the first 50,000 downloads. With the user value for such platforms, you can't acquire the initial users. You have to growth hack your way to other ways. He talked about PR. I think it's also very important to say PR is not about Wired. It's about all these other small blogs that might be more relevant for you. Some tips and tricks on how to reach this product fit. It actually fits very well what Cathrine talked. How many of you were here when we had Cathrine talking about product market fit in the autumn? It's basically her words again about focusing on user, what they want, focus on retention. Don't believe you can forecast the future roadmap because you have no clue. Heini also focused a lot about, can you do this in one platform? It'll be much, much easier for you. In other words, if you're in the early stages, is it just iOS? Maybe that's enough to test. Oh, it's hard to see, but we have also from Zliide, and they have an even harder time, right? Because they not only have to build a platform, they have to do something with hardware. And that just makes it so much harder to do. Hardware is hard. So I think the key lessons from last time were about these platforms take time. It is high risk. You'll most likely have to iterate a lot before you reach that product market fit. And in the early days, it's all about finding out what the users really want. And that will take you several iterations. And remember, it takes time, even for the most successful startup, to reach that product market fit. So today, we're focusing on how to avoid these mistakes we all do. And what we also are having is we're having a Q&A platform. So we will take the Q&As from both me and from Anne Cathrine and from Søren at the end. So can you pigeonhole.at at PreSeed Academy 8. So any questions you have, just add them in the app there. You don't have to download it. You can just go to the URL. And it'll really be great. And then we'll take the Q&A at the end based upon those. Okay? Mental screen? You all remember it? So what was the URL? Pigeonhole.at? Great. Cool. So the biggest problem we had when designing this talk today was actually to choose. Because when we talk about legal aspects, there's so many things. It could be, should it be a personal company versus a liable, a limited company, should it be all other kinds of stuff. We actually have decided to focus mainly on one area, which we think is very important. And that is what happens when you take in other people in your startup. And other people is, we have an investor here, we have a co-founder here, we might have early employees here, right? So basically what happens and what do you have to be aware of? And even though we'll talk a lot about some of the issues that are around this, I think we're all very clear that it's extremely important that you build your teams. So despite that it creates problems, because suddenly when we have an investor, you're actually married to that person. Meaning that you have to care about stuff that is not relevant when you're just alone. So the associations of the company or the board of your company, when you own all the shares in the company, who cares? When suddenly this guy owns 20% of the company, it matters a lot. Can he block some of the decisions? So just keep in mind, we are all pro that you are sharing the cake and getting competences in, whether it's investors, whether it's co-founders, whether employees, and you have to incentivize them, but just be aware that there's some areas that you need to prepare well. I've actually designed what I think is the 10 biggest mistakes we all do in regard to these. And I'll try to go through them. And then hopefully we have some lawyers afterwards that can say, how do you protect you against those? I think the first one is that how many of you have bought an apartment or sold an apartment? Did you use an advisor, aka a real estate agent or a lawyer? Anyone who did it without that? A few? Without any advice at all? Okay, because I wouldn't dare that. I just bought a house. And I've seen many legal documents. I never bought a house before. What is this about, this clause about, ABC? I have no clue. And buying a house is for many the same as going to a startup. Most of you will not doing 10 or 15 startups. So this is sort of a once in a lifetime event where at least for the next 5 years you build this startup. And I think what we all are, all our founders, is we're very cheap, right? We don't want to spend money on advisors because we don't have money and we'd rather have some food at home. Great. But I'll just really warn about not having advisors. Because even when I go in, and I have done many of these agreements, I still use a lawyer for some of that work because I just want to be sure that I don't screw up things. So, for instance, if you have and you're discussing that you are making your agreement with your co-founder, yes, you can find a lot of templates online. but do you really know what you sign? What happens when your co-founder after year 3 decides to move to Bali? What does the shareholders agreement really say? Can he keep the shares? Should he sell the shares? At what price? What happens when you're divorced? Should we have your ex-wife as a shareholder in the company? So I'm just really pro saving money, but I'm also really pro not making these painful things that you'll get this cheap shareholders agreement and you put it in a drawer and you think everything is fine. But in 5 years, when you have to use it, you will find out that you signed something you didn't understand. That is basically my key advice. So talking about lawyers, so let's take an analog here and saying, how many of you are engineers? So what kind of engineers are you? Because that could be an electric engineer. So I wouldn't ask an electric engineer about something about design. I wouldn't ask that kind of engineers about something about chemistry. You're both engineers, but it's a very wide topic. And I actually see legal advice as a bit of the same. So the problem is, if you go down to a random lawyer and say to that random lawyer, could you make a shareholders agreement for us? Or now I got this term sheet from an investor. Is this fair? You can find lawyers, even at the best law firms, that of course will say, yes, I'll take a look at that. What they are missing is the hands-on experience for what is fair or not. They will not know whether this clause 17 about preference shares in this VC agreement, whether that's something you can negotiate out or not. They also can see it from a legal perspective, but they can't see it from hands-on, what is out there. Does it make sense? And so it's not about choosing the biggest law firm you can find. It's about finding a lawyer that actually has done these. And it's easy. You can ask that lawyer and say, how many startups have you advised in this area within the last 12 months? And can I have 3 names? If you're in doubt. And ideally, you want lawyers that have seen it from both perspectives, both from the investor perspective and from the founder perspective. And the good thing is that you can often, for these specialized lawyers, negotiate a relatively good deal initially, because they know that you don't have the money now, but they know that if you're successful, you need more services. Because then you come back to them in 12 months when you need to have a warrant program for your future employees, or when you are raising a Series A round where you need more advice. So just have in mind, you need lawyers for this, and you need someone that has done it before in Denmark, in a legal context in Denmark, and check out their experience. And yes, I have done mistakes both not using a lawyer and not using a specialist lawyer. And have in mind there that something that surprised me when starting with this was about the lawyer will ask you, so who should I represent? Because you can actually represent me as investor, or I can represent the company as such, or I can represent the other side, right? So which right should this lawyer represent? So of course the other party will have a lawyer, but remember, that's not your lawyer, right? That's the other party's advisor. Then some of us, we are then, maybe because we're in a rush, maybe because we want to save some legal costs, we sort of agreeing terms before we really understand it. I see 2 situations again and again. I see the ones where you negotiate something with an investor, and typically part of that will be a term sheet. That's basically bullet points on what you agreed on. And if it's a VC or a professional investor, they basically have a term sheet delivered to you, and there you negotiate on some stuff that could be board control, share classes, stuff like that. When you have agreed on that once, it's really, really hard when you have to go the longer documents 1 month later and say, by the way, I had no clue what I signed, can we negotiate? Because this is actually what the investor had got improvement for in his or her partnership. So that you didn't understand what you signed is just a bad thing for you. I'm not saying you can't negotiate, but you just look like an amateur, and it's really, really hard. So if you had said yes to specific things here, like anti-dilution, like who should basically pay for the employee wants, stuff like that, it's really, really hard to negotiate that out later. So don't sign stuff you don't understand, and yes, I've done that multiple times. The other thing I see is maybe less formal, but that is this important process where you are talking with potential co-founders. And there you are having these talks about, or it could be an early employee, how many percent? That could be one. And I promise you 10%. Is it diluted percentage? Is it, so what happens when we get an investor later on? Will you be diluted or not? Will you get the shares now or the vested over time or whatever? And sometimes I see these that are just like not really clear what is really agreed on. So you have a person that you think you have an agreement with, but you don't have all the details in place, or maybe even worse, the other party actually knows what he or she is talking about, have put in some bullets and say, isn't it what we agreed? That it's there's no keyman clause, and I got all the shares, and I got an anti-dilution clause, and I got the 10%? And you say yes, without really knowing what this anti-dilution clause meant. Okay? So have in mind early on to really understand these areas. I think the fourth one is a broader mistake we do. And that is about assuming that we will be here the next 10 years. First of all, these startups take a lot of time. So we had Heini from Evino last time. I think they started in 9 or 10, something like that. I'm looking around, 9, 10-ish, 11, was it 11? So they are 8 years down the journey now, right? Or 7 or 8 years. So that journey for Evino will maybe be 10 years. And that's most likely the average. So even if from when you get VC investment, the journey time is on average 7 years to an exit. So since when you get VC money, you're most likely 2 or 3 or 4 years old, it's 8, 9, 10, 11 years. So if 4 of you now were 4 co-founders, and you created a company, what do you think the chance that you're all 4 working full-time in that company in 10 years? At least in all the companies I see, it's just like it's not happening. Because a company goes through different stages where you need different people. So the skills you need at Evino now is very different from when there were 3 persons. So it could be skills, it could just be lose interest. Coming back to, hey, I worked in this company for 7 years, now I want to take a break. I want to go surfing in Bali for the next 2 years. Right? Or you just basically disagree after looking at each other for 7 years, you're having the 7-year crisis, and you're basically saying we're breaking up. And you can't avoid that happen. That will happen also for you. And that just means that you have to prepare for that. You need to have these nasty talks about what happens if that person decides to leave. Should that person be allowed to keep the shares? Should that person be forced to sell the shares, etc.? And that's just one scenario. So have in mind, you start 3 or 4 persons a company. You'll not all be there at exit. You hire the first 3 or 4 employees. What should happen with their shares? Is it part of the salary, so they are allowed sort of keeping them, even if they leave in 5 years? Should there be a point in time where you sort of basically done your work? Is that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years? I don't know. Or should you have the more harsh US-style version where you basically say, if you leave this company before exit, your shares will be basically taken away, more or less. It's up to you to decide, but it's really something you have to decide here. You can't decide it here when suddenly these shares have a value, because then these people will say, hey, I earned these shares. Maybe you can be forced by external parties like an investor that will say, I'll only invest if you sort this out. But it's just really, really messy. I've said no to several deals just within the last 2 years where I met them here, and there was basically 1 or 2 co-founders or early investors who was not active in the company. These people owned 40% of the company. And I just said, well, so you're basically giving out to 40% of your company to people who are not adding value. And now I might buy 20%. So we already have only 40% left for the active people. You'll be in trouble as we go. you'll be losing motivation because it's not really your company. 5 minutes? So that also means that you have to think about who will, how you motivate future employees. Because it's not only the founders and the early employees. You'll have to hire these 50 people more. And are you all aligned about whether we are getting diluted more by future employees? Because you can't pay them a market-based salary. Because this data scientist would get 80,000 if he worked for net. Now you are in to work for 40,000. Guess what? That person wants shares. That you need to find out relatively fast and need to get it down in the written agreement. And coming back to what we'll talk a lot about today. So when you read all these documents of the company, I just skip through a lot of them and just say, how does the shareholders agreement look like? That is for me the most important thing, because that is the document that controls many of these things. And I know the other speakers will talk a lot about it. I'm not going into detail. Just have in mind, it's extremely important. And don't sign a shareholders agreement without knowing it. And don't create a company with other shareholders without having a shareholders agreement. If I own 5% of the shares in the company and we don't have a shareholders agreement, you want to sell your company, I can block that. That's not good for you. And then many think that controlling a company is about having 51%. I could own 1% of your company and control it. It's actually relatively easy. And we don't have time for that, but it's just that have in mind that when these other positions are in place in the shareholders agreement, whatever, things break up. So just have in mind that just because this investor only has 10 or 15%, that you're still controlling the company. No, you're not. You can put in a lot of things that basically say that we could fire you. And the evil version will be that I have the right to fire you, and if you're fired, you have to sell your shares, right? So I fire you first because I control the board. Then afterwards I say, well, now you're not affiliated with the company anymore, so you are having keyman clause where you have to sell all your shares to me for 1 krone. Relatively easy. And that means that we have keyman clauses when you are doing this, and you should have that too. Keyman clause basically mean that any investor going into your company would say, I invest in the future, I invest in you as a team. If you're not affiliated with the company, you shouldn't be owning that piece, that big part of the company. So you can negotiate the terms of that, but I actually think it's fair. Maybe also now because I'm a business angel, so I see the other side. That could be. But it's just part of that. But also good for a partnership where you have these 4 co-founders starting a company and saying if one of them wants to leave, well, of course that person will have to give up some of his shares. How much? That's up to you to negotiate what is fair and what the terms should be. And that's something you negotiate in the early days. And finally, I have 20% of the shares, therefore I get 20% of the price at exit. Right? Right? No freaking way. Liquidation preference, share classes, stuff like that, very, very easy. Is it fair? Maybe it's fair. It's just something you have to be aware about. So the first time I read it in the shareholders agreement, I thought it was a mistake. I actually called the other party and said, there must be something wrong. So it means that you get the money 2 times? But yes. Have in mind that just because you own a certain percent doesn't mean that you are getting the same percent out at exit. That's part of the negotiation. You have to be aware of that. And finally, does that person pass the beer test? Because with all this and all these fancy contracts, there's actually theory made of this. It's called incomplete contract theory. And that basically, and the guy more or less got a Nobel Prize for that. And that basically means that we can't negotiate out. So stuff will happen. Even with this long shareholders agreement, things will happen. So therefore, only make companies with people you really think that you can do this for 7-10 years. If you're in doubt, then you're not in doubt. That goes especially for co-founders, but also for the first employees, which will normally will get a certain equity stake, and it for sure goes also for investors. So it's like getting married, but of course you also need to have the breakup clause. What if? Right? So that's basically what I think is the 10 most common and most dangerous things that we do. And it's not to really sound like I haven't done it, because I've done them all multiple times. That's why it's so important that you try to avoid them. We all agree that... Yeah, I can just hear you. Oh, yeah. So please have in mind that we all agree that you have to find people to make startup with. No one, that's a question we didn't talk too much about today, but it's really hard to be a one-man band and try to find investors. And it's even impossible to actually build a startup on your own. And you want people on the journey with you. So even if you don't want investors, you'll most likely have co-founders or employees with equity. Therefore, you have to do it, you should do it, but just have it right. Some of the things I remember from the slides I got in due time, not from you. Oh. Remember the shareholders agreement. It's really, really, really important. That's why we said it so many times. And again, as we said, understand what it means. And you know, yes, you can look up some information online, but you most likely will need some kind of advisor. Also remember, as part of this is the equity, meaning that a big part of the shares are not active in the company. It's a real problem. It happens again and again. It will make your life really, really hard, and it will make you miserable when you have to work for a low salary while the other partners are having a real job, as Søren said. That you try to avoid with various stuff, with the buyback rights, with the vesting, and so on. And of course, a part of this is also warrants to employees. And that is really tricky. I'll just repeat what Anne Cathrine also said, that there's both tax rules and other formal rules. So until now, we could agree something, but due to the Employees Act in Denmark, aka funktionærloven, basically it was invalid. There'll be new rules coming out. And it might be fantastic that I give free shares to an employee. But what will tax say about that? Will that treat it as a gift, so you have to be taxed about that now? Very, very complex area. So when looking into stock options and do that, you also need to use a lawyer. Sorry for that. Sorry. So, what are we having before Christmas? We have an open door event December 19. I don't know how many open slots there's still there. I'm looking for... There's a few slots still there. That is an opportunity not to pitch, but to get 30 minutes feedback from either one of the investment managers at PreSeed or myself. And finally, as Crystal also said, we're back next year. We don't have all the details in place, but don't worry, we will spam you a lot. So we will get notice you when we have the first event. There will be a mix of both talks and the other events, including the open doors.
90%.
We haven't, for that purpose, we don't ask lawyers, because we can't ask AC about we can send out this email, because you'll find out, so we just do it. So with that being said, thank you for coming, and I think we're here for the next 15-20 minutes for beer.